Welcome to the Ascent podcast, a show about inspiring people who explain their path to achievement. I'm your host, Joe Burgess, wealth advisor at Moxie Wealth Management. Today on the show, we chat with Jake Blumberg, Executive Director of GiveMN. We talk about the origins and impact of Give to the Max Day, how the organization RaiseMN eventually developed to support small nonprofits, and lastly, we learn how the Jewish concept of Tikkun Olam shapes Jake's view on public service. Jake, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So just to kind of get started here, you're not from Minnesota originally, are you?
No, I'm not from Minnesota originally. Originally born and raised in Colorado Springs, fourth generation native there, and moved to Minnesota via Washington, D.C. My wife and I were there for about 5 years, and work and professional hopes and dreams brought us this direction.
Well, I have to say, being somebody born and raised in Minnesota, I'd love to live in Colorado someday.
Well, I do have to question my own sound judgment leaving Colorado, particularly January in Minneapolis, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so you mentioned you were out in Washington. How did you find your way back to Minnesota? How did that start?
Yeah, so we were in D.C. for 5 years. We loved being in Washington, D.C. I was able to get a master's degree at George Washington University in political strategy and management. And my wife, who, despite the fact that she chose to marry me, is incredibly smart and talented. And she had offers across the country to go get a PhD in political science. And we narrowed it down to the Twin Cities in Chicago. And I found what was, at the time, and I think will forever be, one of my dream jobs, which was to help the marriage equality campaign in 2012 here in Minnesota for same-sex couples. So came here for that and for my wife to go to school.
Awesome. And the same-sex marriage, that was at the Project 515?
Yeah, so I was hired by Project 515, but Project 515 was one of the two organizations that created the Minnesotans United for All Families campaign to first defeat the constitutional amendment that would have limited marriage between a man and a woman in 2012, which was I believe the 33rd constitutional amendment offered across the country and the first ever that was defeated. And so I was basically loaned over to the campaign from Project 515 and got to be a part of that election, which was 10 years ago. November 8th is the anniversary of that, which blows my mind. And then in 2013, got to be part of passing marriage equality at the Capitol, which was a 6-month quick turn.
Well, and so at the time when Minnesota passed that, what number state were we?
Yeah, so we were moving along. I believe we were the 12th or 13th. I didn't do my research ahead of time. I used to be, right on top of these talking points. They fade after 10 years. But we were the 12th or 13th state to pass it. The first state to defeat a constitutional amendment that would have defined marriage between a man and a woman, and then turned right around 6 months later and passed the other direction. And so we like to call it the Minnesota double play.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I think I read on the Project 515 is it eventually disbanded because they achieved their mission, right?
I got to be the executive director that had a very unusual job, which was to sunset an organization, not because we weren't successful, but because we were completely successful. And that's a really unusual opportunity for any civic leader, to be able to be a part of a mission that is declared accomplished and then choose to say, hey, let's direct those resources elsewhere in the community. Let's not just redefine what we do to stay alive, but let's instead say, hey, we're here for a reason. We were successful, and let's move away and move on to what's next.
And what was next?
Well, for me, I moved into a role with Open Arms of Minnesota, which is a great nonprofit in the Twin Cities that delivers meals to folks living with life-threatening illness throughout the metro area, and got to be a part of a rebuild of a leadership team there that the organization had gone through a number of years of leadership transitions, and was able to lead the fundraising, communications, and volunteer departments there for a few years, and really proud to have been part of the beginning of them as an organization turning a corner, and they are now at the strongest point they've been in as an organization, financially and in terms of impact. And so I got to do that for 2 years, and it was really great to be able to connect and help feed 2,000 families a year that needed it.
Right. Well, I think I had read somewhere that the Open Arms has like 7,000 volunteers.
Yeah, it's volunteer driven, and that is one of the unique parts of the way Open Arms has been structured since its founding over 30 years ago, is that it really is a volunteer army of sorts, and it has a backbone of paid staff, but really it gets its job done because volunteers are engaged. So I got to be a part of helping to engage those volunteers and then also figure out ways to raise funds for it.
Wow. That sounds great. So the one thing I was just trying to process through that was because it was delivering food for people that were critically ill, right? Is it a matter of, I've had people that were going through health issues and it was like friends delivering food because there was other things that they needed to focus on, and boy, one of the things I've learned, I've had a few people close to me pass away in the last few years, and the person who brings the food, you're like, oh my gosh, thank you.
Yeah.
Is it in the spirit of that, or is it the spirit of the type of food to help against the disease?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's both, actually. So The premise is food is medicine, and there's different types of medicine. So there's literal, medically prescribed ways to treat an illness, and often nutrition is a big part of that. But also the love and the care and the community that you get from having a meal that's prepared for you has huge positive health and psychological impacts. And what Open Arms has figured out is a way to have restaurant quality meals. I mean, these are unbelievably tasty meals. I would always have one of the extra ones for lunch. I never had to buy myself lunch or take lunch in because there was just this incredible amount of just delicious restaurant quality food. But then Open Arms has a full-time nutritionist on staff who works with the full-time executive chef to figure out ways to bring nutrition, medicine, and love to those meals. And then they are delivered on a regular basis by volunteers. So there's this line of cars that shows up every day.
Oh, wow.
And they get packed out. It's like volunteer DoorDash. And then people are getting a week's worth of meals delivered to them for individuals, but also full families. And so one of the things that are realities of our U.S. healthcare system is that often being diagnosed with a critical illness or terminal illness is also a bankrupting event in families'
For sure, yeah.
existence. And so often folks are in a position where they're choosing between groceries or prescriptions. And when we can help step up and take groceries off the list, they're able to really focus on healing.
Wow. That is amazing. And so how many years were you there?
Yeah, just right at 2 years, and loved the place. It was an incredible opportunity, and the leadership team that is still there, I keep in close touch with. I'm still deeply connected in support of the mission. But I got my second opportunity at a dream job with GiveMN to be the second executive director since its founding. And that was one of those opportunities that doesn't knock more than once. And so I had to jump at it.
So GiveMN. In my head, it's Give Minnesota to me. I don't know how
both work.
Both work.
Yes.
So that started in 2009, and then when did you take over as the executive director?
Yeah. So I'm the John Adams of GiveMN. I'm the second leader there, and I took over in 2015 on right before 2015 Give to the Max Day, and it's an organization that really I am incredibly lucky to get to be a part of what was foundationally created with a lot of really smart people seeing a need in the late 2000s for our entire nonprofit sector, not just across the state, but across the nation, to be able to engage donors online. It's weird to think about the reality that things like Venmo and PayPal and all of the things that we have at our fingertips, in the late 2000s, none of that existed. It was not a part of the day-to-day. So the idea of being able to process money online was still a really inaccessible thing, and particularly for nonprofits. And
so did the original founders have to create the technology for that, or it existed? It just how did it work?
They basically worked with developers to create the online marketplace that is GiveMN.org, and you did not have other peers. There was no Kickstarter. There was no GoFundMe. We really were one of the first organizations to have an online marketplace for giving. And Give to the Max Day, which is a really interesting founding story too, really was the first giving event of its kind in the country and in the world. And so it started the trends that we're now much more familiar with, like Giving Tuesday and Give Out Day and things like that.
Did Give to the Max start in 2009, or is that something that got developed later?
No, it started in 2009, and it's one of those happy accidents that I think sometimes happen when you've got a bunch of smart people and there is just an immense need for something and a lot of energy around something. So the website was launching. The idea being that every Minnesota nonprofit, and then later every Minnesota school, would be able to raise money through this platform at no cost to them. And the platform was going to be a marketplace where donors could come and do one-stop shopping. They are going to be able to donate to every cause that they care about, find new causes they care about, and do all of it in one place with one transaction. And they had this question of, well, how do we get people to start using the site? How do we get people to be aware of the site?
Where's the money to market?
Exactly.
Right.
And so these really smart people, Dana Nelson, Jen Ford-Reedy, Chris Lamb, and a bunch of others came up with, well, why don't we just have a launch event? Let's have this 24-hour Give-a-Palooza that really gets a lot of attention, and that will get people to start using the site, and that'll be that. And the foundations that had created GiveMN said, we'll even cover the fees. In their minds, as I understand it, I wasn't at the table, they thought, well, maybe a couple $100,000 will be donated, but there'll be a lot of awareness built.
Right.
$14 million was donated on the first Give to the Max Day.
Wow.
And that created a whole different set of opportunities for the organization and really the entire nonprofit sector to figure out, well, what do we do with the fact that there's that type of potential with digital giving?
Right. Dang. So I was trying to think through this. Number one, if you're like the pioneers in this, if you're Give Minnesota and there's no other online giving at the time, I assume that has a long runway for you from a marketing standpoint.
It absolutely created a huge imprint, particularly in Minnesota organizations and Minnesota donors. And so still, Give to the Max Day is a record-breaking gathering of generosity for Minnesota organizations. So more than 14,000 organizations have received a gift through GiveMN.org since our inception. And we just turned the $250 million mark for Give to the Max Day, and we're nearing nearly $500 million in terms of dollars passed through the platform since our inception.
Do other states, have they adopted the same? I mean, obviously everything's online now, but was there any other organizations like this in other states now?
Yeah, so we have a few peers. Colorado was right with Minnesota and continues to have a very similar giving day. The online platform and marketplace that they have is a little less active than ours, and that's because of some of the business choices and values-based decisions GiveMN has made. So GiveMN continues to choose to be a organization and a platform that is at its heart a grassroots entity, meaning access for small organizations and small donors is really what we are trying to prioritize. What we have recognized, particularly as the digital evolution has just skyrocketed since 2009, is that much like any service, organizations that have more resources have more choices. But what we know is that nearly 3/4 of Minnesota nonprofits, and this is true across the country as well, have budgets of less than $1 million.
Sure.
And nearly half of them are doing all of their fundraising based off of volunteers only. There's no staff whatsoever doing the fundraising. And so the question then becomes, how do we provide support and capacity building resources for those organizations? Because as much as we love to partner with the bigger organizations, and we still have great partnerships with organizations like Second Harvest Heartland, who often on Give to the Max Day raises nearly $1 million through the event, as much as we love those partnerships, Second Harvest is choosing us, and we're choosing to partner together, but they have choice. There are lots of organizations that don't have choice whatsoever. We are, for thousands of organizations, their online fundraising site, and in many cases, their only online presence.
Man. Yeah. I mean, if you have a limited budget, you do, or limited experience, I guess.
Limited budget, limited capacity, limited skill set, limited all of those things. And in terms of access, we continue to really prioritize being there for those small organizations and those community leaders. And we often try to think about what would a neighborhood church food shelf in Moorhead need. We're trying to provide that while at the same time still being a resource that Second Harvest Heartland can look towards and really leverage.
You focused on the smaller. What's going on in my head is I'm trying to think of community foundations as opposed to Give Minnesota. And, it sounds like there's a lot of separate the online part of what you guys are doing. Direction of we want to give, we don't know where to give, how do we do it? And I know that community foundations like to put themselves in that. We'll consult with you and we'll help you do that. In a foundation space, would they still want to be working with the larger entities versus the smaller nonprofits? You know what I mean?
We're founded by Minnesota Community Foundations. So we were founded by the St. Paul and Minnesota Community Foundation. We were an idea that was generated by folks at a number of the other foundations like the Minneapolis Foundation and the Blandon Foundation, as well as private foundations like the Bush Foundation. And what those foundations really recognized was that the connections that they can have with community is always going to be limited to the scale of the resources they're able to invest in their communities. And that is always going to be measured in hundreds or maybe a few thousand organizations when the full pie of the sector is tens of thousands of organizations. And so what they were really trying to solve for is how do we create a resource that can help all of these organizations that we can't be in direct relationship with ourselves because our capacity, our resources are also limited in a different direction. And that's where the idea of GiveMN really came from.
So you guys are all working together. Perfect.
Absolutely, yeah. We're continued to be funded and continue to closely partner with the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, the Bush Foundation, and others. And those two foundations continue to help us innovate as well and create new programs and create new ways to support organizations and donors to really grow giving, grow the giving pie.
So tell me about RaiseMN, how it developed, and its focus.
RaiseMN was really a continuation and an iteration of the vision that GiveMN was born through, which was this idea of how do we grow giving, how do we ignite generosity for the organizations in Minnesota that need it, and how do we connect donors with those organizations. So in 2015, the GiveMN board did something that you wish every nonprofit would do on a regular basis, but certainly every time a nonprofit goes through a significant leadership transition, which is to ask some existential questions before moving to the next iteration of leadership for the organization. And the existential question that the GiveMN board asked in 2015 was, we've got GiveMN.org, we've got Give to the Max Day. Community still tells us that that's important and necessary. However, community is also telling us there are other things they need. Our mission is not to create a website. Our mission is to grow giving and ignite generosity. Are there other ways that we can do that? And the board came to the conclusion that the answer was yes, there are other ways to do that. And also, we don't know what those ways are. They use the leadership search as a vision search, which I think is how I luckily got the job, is I had an idea. I think they hired the idea as much as they hired me, thankfully, because that idea is really what has become RaiseMN.
So is it, if we drill down a little bit, is it you're kind of going through an interview process and they're asking what would you do or where would you take the organization, and you had the idea?
Yeah, it was an extensive interview process. There was an executive search firm, Ballinger Leafblad, leading it, and even the search team on that side said, "Wow, this is an intensive search." So it was a multiple-month process, and those of us who made it to the final few rounds were given a significant writing assignment. So it was Labor Day 2015. So I remember it. It was Labor Day 2015 because we had plans to go somewhere and we canceled the plans because I had to spend Labor Day weekend trying to answer the question that they were presenting, which is grow giving, ignite generosity, do it more, not stop doing what we're doing, but add to what we're doing. What would you add and how would you do it? And my connections in community from the marriage campaign and at Open Arms really had indicated to me that there was so much need for grassroots fundraising strategies for organizations to connect with individuals. And what I learned through both of those experiences is that the people who care the most, who are often the volunteers who are engaged with those organizations, are the best potential supporters and donors for an organization. But to figure out a way to engage those individuals, so at Open Arms, thousands of volunteers, how do you figure out a way to engage them not only as volunteers but as donors as well? And we did the same thing with the marriage campaign. Our volunteer base was really the base of what our donor base was, because they care the most. They're actually giving a more limited resource than money. They're giving time. Bill Gates and I have very little in common in terms of resources, except the 24 hours in a day we both have. And so volunteers giving time is actually a more limited resource than giving money. We think of money as more limited than time, but it's actually the opposite direction. And so if you've got someone who's already willing to give you a couple hours of their limited day, chances are, if you can engage them, they will also give you a limited part of their budget, their financial budget. But to figure out how to do that Rubik's Cube to engage them takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of investment. It takes energy. And it often takes staff who are able to do that. And again, what I may have mentioned earlier, half of Minnesota nonprofits are doing all of their fundraising via volunteers. So the idea was, how do we help thousands of organizations who can't hire a competent development director have the skills of a development director? How do we offer that at scale? And that was the idea, was we will create some sort of program that will act like the website does for gift processing, only for fundraising capacity and knowledge. And RaiseMN, a few years later, after they hired me and we went out and had, in my first 90 days, I had 68 meetings with leaders in the community, really trying to kick the tires on this idea and try to figure out if it existed somewhere else or if it should exist somewhere else rather than GiveMN. And what we kept hearing was, it should exist and it doesn't exist. And by the way, my organization, I don't want it to exist here, but I would love for someone to have this that I could then engage with. And so community had driven the need for GiveMN.org. Mm-hmm. Community drove the need for RaiseMN.
I think that a lot of nonprofits, when they're trying to create a campaign, there's a process of you hire a campaign manager and spend lots of money on that process, right? And I'm affiliated. I went to a little Catholic school in a small town. There was an analysis done. And the dollar amount that they gave that said, and it's kind of a blue-collar community, was like, here's the number of millions that we think you can raise. And, of course, I'm not that connected to it. But, I mean, I'm connected to the school, but I'm not connected to how you go about determining that number, right? My first thought when it came out was, whoa.
No way. Right.
No way.
No way.
Right? Unfortunately, that campaign actually did not come through to fruition. But I thought, I'm not sure who their interviewing because I just don't know that would exist in that community. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You almost feel like it's a compound issue if you're putting a lot of money up there that's probably stretching you thin to have somebody lead a campaign to then, if we miss the mark, that, so twofold. One, obviously Raise Minnesota allows some efficiency there, so it's less of a cost. But two, do you find that they're able to get a better feel for the possibilities of that entity?
Yeah, so there are multiple aspects to that part of the Rubik's Cube that we were trying to work to spin and solve for the Minnesota nonprofit sector. And so when you set up that scenario, what you have are a couple of key questions. One, it's the same question that any of us are faced when our car won't start, which is, where do I take my car and what mechanic can help me get my car running? Theoretically, any mechanic can. However, we all know that some of them are going to do it better. Some of them are going to do it more inexpensively. Some of them are going to do it more ethically. And some of them aren't going to fix it at all. How do you choose the right mechanic? Often, the way we go about choosing the right mechanic, or at least how I do, is I ask my friends. I ask my network. I say, hey, who do you trust? Who is going to give me a good price and make sure my car can start on a February winter day? And I go to those folks. And then I tell that to other people. And the same thing often happens if the mechanic doesn't do a good job. What is the fundraising equivalent of a mechanic? Well, you normally will have a fundraising strategist either on staff or on the board or in the community that you're tapping for this. And much like all mechanics are not created equally, all fundraising strategists and consultants are not created equally. Sometimes a mechanic's entire drive is their own bottom line, and they could care less about if your car actually starts on that February winter day. And some mechanics are going to give it to you labor cost included because they just want the car to start. Mm-hmm. We want the car to start at RaiseMN. We are not here for our own bottom line. We are here to meet a community need, which is a lot of nonprofits being able to turn on their fundraising engines in their communities. And we deeply believe, it's one of our core values at GiveMN, that there are enough resources in the community to do what our communities need. We just need to figure out a way to tap and leverage those resources. We need to operate from abundance. We need to figure out a way to think through solving our community problems together, not from a place of they're impossible or there's not enough, but instead from a place of there is enough, how do we find it? How do we leverage it? And RaiseMN's an auto shop for fundraising programs that need a tune-up and need to get back on the road.
Hold that thought for a second. We're going to take a quick break here. After the break, I want to discuss some of the metrics of RaiseMN and the impact you guys have made in the community. Hey there, this is Joe. You know me as the host of this podcast, but did you know that I'm also the co-founder and president of Moxie Wealth Management, a boutique wealth management firm in Minneapolis, Minnesota? My team and I excel at taking complex family and business planning concepts and making our financial advice easy to understand. We recognize the trust that executives and families place in our team and value our role in helping our clients be intentional with their assets. When you partner with Moxie, my team and I focus on creating a plan that encompasses your financial goals and philanthropy, while also understanding how you want your wealth to impact your family and future generations. You can trust our unique expertise to build a thoughtful yet strategic wealth and legacy plan for your future. To learn more about me and my firm, send me an email at joe@moxiewealth.com. That's joe@moxiewealth.com. I'm a registered representative and investment advisor representative of Securian Financial Services, Inc. Securities and investment advisory services offered through Securian Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. North Star Resource Group is independently owned and operated. Moxie Wealth Management is affiliated with North Star Resource Group. So, Jake, tell me now, how many organizations has RaiseMN helped?
Yeah. We launched in 2017 with the idea being that we needed to figure out if we even had a concept that could be proven, which was the idea, let me throw another metaphor at you, of being coaches, being a fundraising personal trainer for someone. You're not guaranteed when you hire a personal trainer, I know this unfortunately very well, to get into good shape simply by hiring the personal trainer. Yeah. However, if you hire a good personal trainer and you do what they ask you to do, chances are a couple of things are going to happen. One, you're going to get into better shape in a more safe way. And eventually, you're not going to need that personal trainer anymore. You're going to have all the workouts. You're going to know how to do the things safely. You're going to know how to get the most out of what you need. You're going to know how to reach your goals. And you can stop seeing that personal trainer and do it on your own. We were trying to figure out if there was a way for us to be personal trainers that floated from organization to organization with a business model that was not based on them forever using us, but instead a business model that was based on us then being able to move on to the next client and the next client and help them get into better shape. So we piloted it in 2017 and it worked. All of a sudden, we needed to double and triple the size of our test because just because it worked with 5 or 12 organizations does not mean you actually have a concept. It just means you were lucky. And my wife's a professor in political science. She does statistics all of the time. That is correlation, not causation. She would be very clear on that. So we needed to really get a much larger representative sample. And we were in the process of scaling up and had worked with around 100 organizations when spring of 2020 came. And all of a sudden, the nonprofit sector was hit as hard as any sector other than hospitality with the realities of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then a couple months later, the realities, particularly here in Minnesota, of the civil unrest after Mr. Floyd's murder. And these organizations were in positions where need had skyrocketed and their ability to connect with donors had completely changed. And the model had completely changed. And for some organizations like GiveMN, we were already going digitally. So for us, it was just a matter of sitting at our desk chairs at home versus at the office. But for a food shelf, for a theater, for a community-facing social justice organization, the lack of ability to be in person with people completely hollowed out their revenue model at a time that they were being asked to do so much more. And so GiveMN, with our mission to really be construction, scaffolding, and support around these organizations, spun up two things. We said we were going to create a pandemic Give to the Max Day, which at the time we partnered with Governor Walz's office to create Give Forward Minnesota, which was a campaign that raised over $7 million in May 2020 for nearly 4,000 organizations, I believe. And we also said, what can we do with our RaiseMN program here to help? And our board came together at a special session, and I asked the board to approve our providing coaching services free of charge to as many organizations as we could serve for as long as we needed to get them on their feet. And so we did an all-hands-on-deck effort with about 8 staff members, because GiveMN is small but mighty. Mm-hmm. And we just started opening up every 45-minute block we could on Zoom for nonprofits to sign up and come in and get crisis response coaching from us. And in 2020, we coached more than 500 organizations, helping them think through how they could respond not only to the pandemic and the increased need and the decreased access to their traditional resources, but also for them to think about how they could leverage that opportunity, how they could actually thrive in that opportunity. And what we saw in 2020 and 2021 was that people were in a giving mood in a way that they historically had never been before in our kind of modern history. Folks had more income that they weren't spending in other places, and they wanted to support their community with that income. And so the organizations we were able to partner with through RaiseMN, through Give to the Max Day, through Give Forward Minnesota, through some other giving campaigns that we were able to do in 2020 and 2021, really helped generate more than $100 million that was donated to more than 10,000 organizations through the various GiveMN and RaiseMN programs that we have.
Wow, that is amazing. I do know, yeah. I mean, people in the pandemic, there was such a gap. After the first couple of months when we got our bearings, either it didn't affect you that significantly or it majorly affected you. Like there was one or the other. I'm in finance, and people talk about, for your average client 12 months later, what was their net worth? Was it better or worse? And It was significantly better for most people who were in a white-collar office position that could work remotely and all that. And any face-to-face people, it really decimated everything that they were doing.
Well, and so I guess I heard from finance experts like yourself, they described it as a V-shaped recovery and a V-shaped experience, right? So everything went way down, and then at least if you look at things like the stock market, then it bounced almost straight up once we got our bearings. But that does not measure what the impact was at the community level for folks with lower incomes, with non-remote capable jobs, and for folks who already had systemic inequities working against them. So if you are a BIPOC individual, you already had systems of white supremacy working against you in the best of times. In the worst of times, you had those systems plus the realities of unprecedented pandemics that were impacting you directly. And what we know when we look at the nonprofit sector is that BIPOC-led organizations.
Can you explain BIPOC?
I absolutely can. So it's an acronym, thanks for asking me, that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color.
Okay.
So non-white, non-dominant identities. And in Minnesota, the dominant identity is white. I believe over 80% of Minnesotans identify as white. Across the country, it's closer to a 50-50 split. Here's what is interesting in the nonprofit sector and something that has to be addressed, and we can only address it if we acknowledge it. If you compare a similar white-led organization to a similar, and when I say similar, I mean in terms of their mission pursuit, in terms of their placement in community, in terms of their budget, in terms of their capacity, there have been numerous studies when you compare those two directly that white-led organizations are raising 34% more money than the Black-led or Indigenous-led or person of color-led organization.
Are we talking nonprofits?
We're talking nonprofits. And so you have this gap already that says if the only real difference between these organizations is the identity of the leaders, and you've got a 34% difference in terms of the revenue that they are generating, when you think about that then in the context of a crisis like we have been in, that gap and that inequity is only going to accelerate and deepen. And so for GiveMN, where we are really prioritizing smaller organizations, BIPOC-led organizations in greater Minnesota, what we are trying to figure out is how do we help them bridge those gaps? And how do we also make sure that folks understand those gaps exist? Because the first part of fixing a problem is acknowledging you have one. And the nonprofit sector is no better than any other sector of our economy in the United States. We have a problem with systems of white supremacy and systemic racism, and we have to address them. And so we're trying to work on that.
Was it very similar to everyone else on the pivot in the pandemic? It sounded like that you had a lot more fundraising for those organizations in need, which is fantastic. But administering your service, was that a fairly smooth transition as far as face-to-face to more remote? How did that go for you?
For GiveMN, we were unbelievably privileged. We were already a digital-focused organization. We already had been doing some of our trainings virtually so we could reach across the state and across the country. So for us, really, the pivot was helping other organizations pivot rather than our own. So we did not have nearly the challenges that most of the partner organizations that we have were experiencing. And so what we tried to do is leverage that privilege as an opportunity to help bridge those gaps for those other organizations. Because for many of them, it was a significant time of, wow, hunger is at a height that we have not seen since the Great Depression. How do we pay for that? And how do we deliver food to folks who no longer can be in person with us. That's going to cost a lot more. That's going to be a lot harder to do. It's going to take more people power, and it's going to take more dollar power to do it. And so for us, it was really a question of how could we help that dollar power answer for those partners of ours.
Is GiveMN and RaiseMN, I guess, part of the same entity there, right? But how is your funding? How does that work for you guys?
We are a multi-pronged social enterprise, actually. So I think one of the just easy misunderstandings that happen is that we're categorized as a nonprofit. So people think money doesn't matter, or that, every dollar in has to go right out the door, and we have to, at the end of our fiscal year, have $0 left because we can have no profit. No, it's a matter of what you invest your dollars in. Instead of having a profitable year where shareholders get payouts of dividends, the community should be getting payouts of dividends through the work that we do and the money that we raise. And so we are a multi-featured social enterprise. RaiseMN is both underwritten by community foundations and individual donors to provide scholarships to the organizations who can't afford to access our services themselves. And we also have a hourly rate that is less than half of what the marketplace charges for fundraising, consulting, and coaching services available to nonprofits to access our coaching at $125 an hour. And typically you're finding it $300 to $500 an hour for the folks that are on staff at GiveMN in the marketplace. And so we generate revenue through the RaiseMN coaching program. Our platform also has a processing fee that we encourage, nay, almost make impossible for donors not to cover on behalf of nonprofits. So our nonprofit partners get 100% of the donation, and then credit card fees, platform fees, and support for GiveMN are covered by the donors giving more abundantly. 94% of donors cover the processing fee on GiveMN when they make a gift, and that creates a significant revenue stream for us as well. So between RaiseMN and GiveMN.org, those two social enterprises account for about 3/4 of our budget. This upcoming fiscal year will be just over $2 million as an operating budget. And that final quarter comes from general operating funding from foundations, corporations, and individuals that we fundraise ourselves.
Got it. Great. Well, so I want to veer into a different area for the moment. And I was thinking a little bit more personally for you. Obviously, we've got a podcast that is around people's path to success and how they think about it. How would you define being successful?
I was raised in a multi-faith household. I was raised in a Lutheran and Jewish household, had a Jewish parent and a Lutheran parent. And they gave me an opportunity in my first 13 years to be exposed to both of those faith traditions. And then at 13, which is a pivotal age in both Judaism and Christianity for choice making, they provided me with the opportunity to choose either faith. And at the time I said, I can't choose. I don't want to choose either. I had a really interesting conversation with my dad at the time, who was Jewish. My dad's side of the family is the Jewish half. And he had this sit down with me where he said, son, I respect the choice that you're making. I support the choice that you're making to not go either direction. But here's one thing you need to know. There will be times, whether you choose it or not, that people will choose to see you as Jewish. From my face, from my last name, from my choice in sandwiches, the cultural and religious Judaism was going to be ascribed to me whether I chose it myself or not. And that wasn't really something that I understood at 13 and didn't really understand it until I moved to Minnesota and got involved in the same-sex marriage campaign, and started really understanding the values and principles that were driving me. And the easiest description of how I define success is through a Jewish principle called Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam effectively means that we are called as humans to make perfect an always imperfect world, knowing we never will. So in another tradition, the Sisyphean idea of always rolling a rock up a hill, knowing you could never get to the top of the hill. And yet, we as humans, or as Jews, are called to do that work anyway. And for me, success is waking up every day and having an opportunity to try to make more perfect this imperfect world that we're in, knowing that I never will. But knowing that I never will is not an excuse not to do the work. In fact, it is the reason to do the work. That's how I get to success.
I've asked this question a number of times. That might be one of the better answers I've ever heard.
Thanks.
Thank you. What do you think has been the biggest lesson you've learned when it comes to business or maybe leading people?
I think it probably is around the idea of authenticity. So, I thought I was going to be a political strategist for my career. Mm-hmm. Came to Minnesota, got to be a political strategist. And it was everything that I thought it was going to be. And then it also was a lot more. It was incredibly intense. There is no stop when you have a 1 day of sale structure, meaning election day, you're at the end of the race. And you're running to that finish line as fast as you can, as much as you can. And I remember getting in trouble for not responding to a text message at 2 a.m. in October leading up to Election Day. How could I not be working? It was 2 a.m. And what I realized in some fundraising conversations that I was having was that I really needed to be clear as to why I was in the work. I was one of very few straight men in the same-sex marriage movement across the country. As far as we could tell, and we gathered as a federation of these organizations on an annual basis, I was one of 3 straight guys in a leadership position across the country in the marriage movement. And so, as a social justice person, I had been taught to always refer to my wife as my partner. I wanted to create space for folks who didn't have a chance to identify them as their spouse or their wife or their husband. And the first or second meeting I had with a donor, I was with my boss at the time, a mentor and older sister, Ann Kaner Roth of blessed memory, whose handwriting is on my arm. We lost her a few years ago to brain cancer. She was with me at this meeting. We walked away, and in a very serious tone, she said, "You can't say partner anymore." Okay, but what do I say? And she said, "You have to refer to her as your wife because you cannot come across like you are trying to be something that you are not to the folks that you are connecting with. It's not about a message. It's not about them. It is about you being your authentic self and them being able to trust that they are with an authentic person across the table from them." And I had to change an entire language model that I thought was the right thing for 10 years while working in the very movement that I thought I was using that language to support. Authenticity is really where leaders' rubber meets the road, I think.
That's great. So when you're looking forward, how far out do you is your vision on things in that? Do you see yourself always being in a nonprofit world? Do you ever see going back political, anything for profit? I guess part of the thought process I have is, there's people that I've interviewed before that are serial entrepreneurs, and every 3 or 4 years they create something. Maybe they sell it, they move on, they create a different thing, and they do it. Do you see yourself as one of those people that every 3 or 4 years you like the newness or the freshness or something different? Or is it something where when I find my lane, I'm just good in my lane? You know what I mean?
So I had an opportunity to be involved in a number of different civic-facing organizations throughout my early career through now. And so I had an opportunity to raise money for scholarship dollars in higher ed, an opportunity to raise money for political campaigns, for Open Arms, for GiveMN. And I realized that what motivates me is change at scale. So the impact that you're making when you're providing meals to 2,000 families at Open Arms is unbelievable impact, and it is deep impact, and it is potentially life-saving impact. But it's also limited to 2,000 folks. There's a whole heck of a lot more people out there who are in need of support. And what the marriage campaign provided me was a chance to see what change at scale could look like. And that's what I think I've become addicted to, is the idea of how do we create change that can affect folks you've never met before and will never meet. One of the things, even thinking about it, just gave me chills. One of the things that gives me chills is when I am out in the community and I hear a couple talking about, this is my husband, this is my husband, this is my wife, this is my wife, a same-sex couple out there talking about it and just introducing themselves as that. I hear it at a table every once in a while at a restaurant or at a movie theater. And I never tell them that I had the opportunity to be a part of the marriage campaign. Because to me, the joy of that was the fact that their lives were improved. It wasn't about my involvement. It was about the fact that they got to marry the love of their life. They got to support their family. They got to be in community. They got to be supported by their community. And so for me, I think I'm motivated Tikkun Olam at scale, making perfect an imperfect world for as many people as I can whenever I'm provided the opportunity to do so. And my nervousness is that you don't normally get to even have one dream job. I believe I've had two. I really believe the marriage campaign and GiveMN are both dream jobs for me. And I feel like my hit rate was way early. So I'm really nervous. Like, what's the next 4 decades? Because I'm sure not retiring early as a nonprofit executive. How am I possibly going to find another dream job? I've been so lucky. I'm so grateful for that. And my hope is that being motivated by helping change at scale will present another opportunity at some point that will allow me to make a difference. And that's what it's all about for me.
Absolutely. Well, Jake, we're going to leave it there today, but thanks for all your insight. It was great.
Thanks. It was a great conversation. Thanks for having me on and for the really thoughtful way that we covered things that wasn't like a recitation of my resume. So Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
You've been listening to Jake Blumberg, Executive Director of GiveMN. You can learn more about Jake and GiveMN at GiveMN.org. In addition, information on RaiseMN and their development support program can be found at RaiseMN.org. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ascent podcast, a show about inspiring people who explain their path to achievement. I'm your host, Joe Burgess, Wealth Advisor and founding partner of Moxie Wealth Management. You can learn more about me and my firm at moxiewealthmanagement.com. That's MOXIE wealthmanagement.com. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.